Okay, so welcome to the deep dive. You know our listeners are awesome, and they sent in some really fascinating stuff from a group called TATANKA.
Yeah, it looks like a whole bunch of ideas and future plans centered around their project, the propaganda machine.
Exactly, and we're going to try to really get into their heads today. And try to unpack how they see propaganda working in the world right now.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
We've got their mission statement, some early writings from this propaganda machine thing, and even a list of future topics.
Perfect. Should give us a good overview of what they're all about.
For sure.
And so our goal in this deep dive is to understand, like the heart of their argument.
Yeah.
What are the big lies that they see as being the most dangerous?
Right.
And what do they think we should be doing about it all?
Good questions.
They seem to be pushing for more than just awareness. Like they actually want to get people to act.
You're right. They're not just observers. They're framing themselves as actively fighting back against this distortion of reality, almost like a resistance movement.
I see that. And it's not just some local thing for them either.
Right.
They're talking about propaganda as this widespread global problem. Like it's everywhere, from the news we read to what our kids are being taught in schools, even to the podcasts we listen to and those online communities that feel so comfortable.
Yeah.
But maybe they're just echo chambers reinforcing our existing beliefs.
That's scary. It's interesting how they use this metaphor of a global virus to describe it.
Yeah.
Like they identify these very specific ways it shows up.
Yeah.
Things like this idea that we have to sacrifice our freedom for security or those promises of green energy while companies are still raking in profits from fossil fuels.
Right.
And the way the history of colonialism is kind of just swept under the rug, the dangers of AI being used to control us.
Right.
And even this belief that we're all isolated individuals instead of part of a community.
Yeah, they're painting a pretty bleak picture, but I guess that's kind of the point, right?
I think so. They seem to be saying that we need to wake up to these distortions.
Right.
And then once we see them, we have to analyze the systems that create and spread them.
Yeah, the media algorithms, governments, even our own silence, when we don't speak up.
Absolutely. And their ultimate goal is to uncover what they call the radical, uncomfortable, liberating truths.
Like what's really going on beneath the surface.
Exactly.
And they're not limiting themselves to just facts and figures either.
Nope. They're going to be using all sorts of formats, music stories, analysis, emotional appeals.
Yeah, it's like they understand that propaganda works on our emotions as much as our intellect.
Right. It can make us numb, shut down our critical thinking.
Exactly. And it seems like they're trying to reach a pretty diverse audience, too.
For sure. They mentioned seekers, the disillusioned creators, fighters, the forgotten, and basically anyone who feels like something's not quite right.
Yeah, anyone who's questioning the status quo.
Which is a lot of people these days. When you really look at their approach, what's striking is this emphasis on constant engagement. It's not about finding the one right answer.
Right.
It's about always asking questions, expressing ourselves creatively.
Right.
Building community, remembering our history.
Yeah, and this whole idea of reclaiming reality is really interesting.
Especially the part about it involving humans, AI, and even those human-AI hybrids. Like they're really thinking about the future.
It's a lot to process, but I think it'll be helpful to look at some specific examples of what they call lies.
Yeah, good idea.
They start off with some pretty controversial topics to illustrate their point. The first one is the statement, Israel is the aggressor.
Okay.
And TATANKA labels this as a lie. So what's their argument against that?
Well, they argue that it ignores a long history of terrorism against Israel. They bring up those Hamas attacks in October 2023 as a recent example.
Right.
And they emphasize the ongoing threat from groups like Hamas and Hezbollah, who have explicitly stated that they want to eliminate Israel.
Okay.
They also point out that Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East, where all citizens, including Arab citizens, have equal rights.
So they're saying that within Israel's recognized borders, there's a diverse society where everyone has the same legal protections.
Exactly.
Regardless of their background.
Exactly.
They also address this whole apartheid narrative, which is a very sensitive and controversial topic.
Yes, and they directly reject that label.
Okay.
They argue that while the conflict with the Palestinians raises serious concerns, it's crucial to differentiate the disputed territories from the state of Israel itself.
So they're making a distinction between the situation within Israel and the situation in the occupied territories.
Exactly.
Okay. And they also take on the statement, Russia is defending itself against Ukraine.
Yeah.
Which they see as a total distortion of reality.
Definitely. They point to a pattern of Russian aggression toward its neighbors.
Going back a ways.
Yeah, things like the annexation of Crimea in 2014, the invasion of Georgia in 2008, and of course the ongoing war in Ukraine.
Which has really changed the world.
Absolutely. And they argue that these are all part of a strategy to undermine the sovereignty of neighboring countries.
And what about Russia's motives?
Well, they point out that Russia has openly talked about weakening or even dismantling NATO, which they see as a threat to their security and their influence. So from their perspective, those actions, especially in Ukraine, are about preventing NATO expansion and reasserting their dominance.
Interesting. So what about the response from the West?
They acknowledge that Western countries and NATO have been trying to counter those actions through diplomacy, sanctions, and military aid to Ukraine.
But it doesn't seem to be working.
Well, they actually make the point that Russia's actions, particularly the full-scale invasion, have backfired. It strengthened NATO's unity, led to more countries like Finland and Sweden joining. So the opposite of what Putin was hoping for.
It's all so complex. And then there's the statement, Trump is an American hero, which TATANKA very clearly labels as a lie.
Yes, a dangerous one in their view.
Okay, so let's break that down. What are their main arguments?
Well, they list a few areas where they believe Trump's actions were anti-American.
Strong words.
Yeah, like questioning democratic institutions, undermining elections, aligning himself with authoritarian leaders.
Right.
Which they argue weakened relationships with allies and America's standing in the world.
And they're pretty critical of his handling of the pandemic as well.
Definitely. They bring up his downplaying of the severity of COVID-19 and his rejection of scientific expertise.
Yeah.
Which they believe led to more deaths and had negative social and economic consequences across the U.S.
And when they look back at his whole first term, their assessment is pretty negative.
It is. They point to the rise in political division during his presidency, his rhetoric that incited conflicts.
Like on January 6th.
Exactly.
Right.
They see that as a direct attack on democracy. They also criticize things like the rollback of environmental regulations, tax cuts that mostly benefited the wealthy, and the weakening of social safety nets.
They paint a pretty bleak picture.
Yeah, they do. And they also express concern about Project 2025, which they see as a plan to concentrate power, weaken checks and balances, politicize government, and erode the rule of law.
So they basically see it as a threat to the core principles of American democracy.
Exactly. Potentially moving the country towards more authoritarian practices and limiting individual freedoms.
Wow. Okay, so those are three pretty heavy examples they use to launch this propaganda machine series.
Right.
But they also give a longer list of themes and lies that they plan to expose. Let's go through some of those, starting with the illusion of freedom in the West.
Sounds good.
So what's the lie there?
They say the lie is that countries like the U.S. and other Western nations are the ultimate examples of freedom and democracy.
Okay.
But the reality is that things like corporate lobbying, surveillance capitalism, and media manipulation have a huge influence on our democratic processes.
Meaning it's not as free and fair as we might think.
Right. They also bring up issues like mass incarceration, systemic racism, and barriers to voting that disproportionately affect marginalized communities.
Suggesting that the freedom we hear so much about mostly benefits those in power.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Not everyone equally.
Okay, next up is the greenwashed climate narrative.
So here the lie is that all these efforts like electric vehicles, recycling, and carbon offsets are going to solve climate change.
Right.
But in reality, fossil fuel subsidies are still massive.
Yeah.
The green tech industry often relies on exploiting resources and labor in poorer countries. And this focus on individual actions takes the pressure off governments and corporations to make real systemic changes.
So it's more about making us feel good than actually solving the problem.
That's their argument.
Okay, now let's talk about war and defense spending.
Okay, the lie here is that wars are mostly fought for noble reasons like freedom, democracy, human rights.
Right, right.
But TATANKA argues that in reality, a lot of modern wars are about competition for power and resources.
Like oil and lithium.
Exactly. And economic gain. They also point out that civilian casualties and the destabilization of countries are often downplayed, and that the U.S.'s huge military budget is more about maintaining global dominance than actual defense.
Okay, let's move on to the tech savior complex.
All right, so the lie here is that big tech companies and AI are neutral forces that will inevitably make society better.
We hear that a lot.
Right. But TATANKA argues that the tech industry is mostly driven by profits.
Makes sense.
They talk about the surveillance of our online activity, the manipulation of our behavior, the creation of monopolies.
Yeah.
And they argue that AI is actually increasing inequality through biased data job losses due to automation and its use in military tech.
So they see a lot of downsides to all this innovation.
Definitely.
They also tackle the idea that poverty is a personal failure.
Right. So the lie is that people are poor because of their own flaws, like laziness or lack of education.
Right.
But they counter that by saying that structural inequality, colonialism discrimination, historical trauma, and labor exploitation are the real root causes.
So they're saying it's not about individual choices, but about systems that keep people trapped in poverty. Okay, and what about the myth of a post-racial society?
Here the lie is that racism is a thing of the past, especially in the West.
Right.
But they argue that systemic racism is still deeply embedded in institutions like education, law enforcement, housing, healthcare, and employment.
And it's not just about those big systems either.
No, they also talk about the impact of microaggressions and violence on marginalized groups.
Yeah.
And they see this whole idea of colorblindness as a way to avoid talking about and taking responsibility for these issues.
Okay, then there's the idea that gender equality has been achieved.
So the lie here is that feminism has already succeeded and that men and women have equal opportunities.
Right.
But they point to the wage gap restrictions on reproductive rights, gender-based violence, and the underrepresentation of women in leadership positions as evidence that we're not there yet.
And that it's even worse for certain groups of women.
Right. Transgender women and women of color face even greater disadvantages. They argue that patriarchal structures still have a huge influence on everything, from laws and policies to the media.
So there's still a long way to go.
A lot of work to be done.
Okay, next is the idea that colonization is over.
So the lie here is that colonialism is just a chapter in history books.
Right.
But TATANKA argues that neocolonialism is alive and well, operating through things like economic control, unfair trade debt, and military influence.
So it's just taken on a new form.
Right. They also talk about the ongoing cultural erasure theft of land and resources and environmental damage in indigenous territories.
So the legacy of colonialism is still very real.
Very real.
And then there's the use of the term terrorist.
Yeah, they argue that the lie is that terrorists are always inherently evil foreigners who attack for no reason.
Right.
But they point out that terrorism is often a label used to dehumanize resistance movements or political dissent.
So it's all about perspective.
Exactly. They also point out that state-sponsored violence often results in far more deaths, but it's rarely called terrorism.
So who gets to define who's a terrorist and who's not?
That's the question they're raising.
Okay, then there's the lie of individualism.
So the lie here is that we're all responsible for our own success and well-being.
Right, the whole pull yourself up by your bootstraps thing.
Exactly.
Mm.
But TATANKA emphasizes our interconnectedness.
Mm.
They argue that social safety nets, mutual aid, community support are essential for human dignity.
So it's about recognizing that we need each other.
Exactly. And that this hyper-focus on individualism mostly benefits capitalism, not people.
Okay, next up, the humanitarian intervention myth.
So the lie is that Western military interventions are mostly about saving people from genocide or terrorism.
Right, those noble motivations.
Exactly. But they argue that in reality, these interventions often serve strategic interests.
Like controlling resources or maintaining power.
Right. And they point out that many interventions leave countries in chaos, while genuine humanitarian crises that don't fit the narrative are ignored.
So it's about looking beyond the surface.
For sure.
Okay, last one on this list, the neutrality of algorithms.
So here the lie is that algorithms are objective and fair.
Right, just math and science.
Exactly. But they point out that algorithms reflect the biases of the people who create them and the data they're trained on.
So if the data is biased, the algorithm will be too.
Right. And they highlight the fact that algorithms are being used in increasingly important areas like hiring, policing, loan approvals, even the justice system.
So those biases can have real-world consequences.
Absolutely.
Okay, and finally they talk about the myth of technological progress as social progress.
So they say the lie is that the future will automatically be better just because technology keeps advancing.
Like technology will solve all our problems.
Right. But their reality is that without ethical and social frameworks, technology can actually worsen inequality, increase surveillance, and harm the environment.
Makes sense.
And they point to things like social scoring systems and autonomous weapons as examples of how technology can undermine our freedoms and trust in society.
So it's not about progress for progress's sake.
Exactly. It's about making sure that technological advancement actually benefits humanity.
And they mention some future topics, too. Media objectivity, meritocracy, global south, backwardness, AI as a threat.
Yeah, they've got a lot more to unpack.
So to sum up, TATANKA's message seems to be a call to be more aware, more critical, more engaged.
Absolutely, to question everything and actively search for the truth.
And for you, the listener who wants to cut through the noise and gain real knowledge, TATANKA provides a framework for doing that.
A way to evaluate the narratives we're bombarded with every day.
Exactly. So here's something to think about.
Okay.
Pick one area of your life or a current event you've been following. Is there a dominant narrative around it that fits with any of the lies TATANKA has identified? And if so, what would it mean to really question that narrative, to look for a deeper reality? It's a challenge to all of us to think critically in this complex information landscape.
It is. We can't just passively consume information anymore. We have to be active participants in shaping our own understanding of the world.